September 4th, 2025. The morning sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet, but aboard the USS Jason Dunham, every radar screen was already glowing. Two fast-moving contacts had just appeared from the south, flying low and fast, their bearing locked directly on the destroyer. The officer of the deck raised his binoculars toward the dark smudge of the Venezuelan coastline. Nothing visible yet, just the faint glow of dawn and the endless churn of the Caribbean. But the radar told a different story. Those contacts weren't slowing down. They weren't deviating. They were heading straight for his ship. In less than 4 minutes, two Venezuelan F-16 fighter jets would scream across the Dunham's bow at 400 knots. And what happened next would push both nations to the edge of a decision neither wanted to make. To understand what was about to unfold, you need to know what brought these two forces to this stretch of ocean. 48 hours earlier, the United States military had carried out its first airstrike in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1989. The target was a small speedboat in the southern Caribbean, allegedly carrying drugs and operated by members of Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that the Trump administration had designated as a foreign criminal organization. The strike was sudden and absolute. The boat disintegrated, and all 11 people aboard lost their lives. President Trump announced the operation on September 2nd, posting footage of the explosion to Truth Social and calling those on board drug traffickers. He promised more operations to come. Secretary of State Marco Rubio went even further. Speaking at a press conference in Mexico City the following day, he made the administration's position unmistakably clear.
Interdiction doesn't work because these drug cartels, what they do is they know they're going to lose, 2% of their cargo. They bake it into their economics. What will stop them is when you blow them up, when you get rid of them.
For decades, counter-narcotics in the Caribbean had meant interdiction. Coast Guard cutters pulling alongside suspicious vessels, boarding parties, arrests, and legal processes. This was something else entirely. In Caracas, the reaction was immediate and furious. President Nicolas Maduro called the strike an act of imperial aggression, an act carried out without due process. Venezuela's foreign ministry accused Washington of taking the lives of 11 people without evidence, without trial, and without warning. And somewhere in the Venezuelan military command structure, a decision was made. If the Americans were going to operate this close to Venezuelan waters, they would be reminded whose neighborhood this was. The USS Jason Dunham wasn't supposed to be in the Caribbean. Just weeks earlier, the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer had been conducting routine operations elsewhere. But in August, new orders came from the Pentagon. New tasking, new theater. Report to U.S. Southern Command immediately. The Dunham was one of 3 destroyers rushed to the region as part of the Trump administration's counter-narcotics surge. The USS Gravely arrived first, followed by the USS Sampson. Together with the amphibious assault ship USS Iwo Jima and her Marine Expeditionary Unit, they formed the largest American naval presence in Latin America in over 3 decades. Armed with Tomahawk cruise missiles, a 5-inch deck gun, and the Aegis combat system capable of tracking over 100 targets simultaneously, the Dunham was designed for dominance at sea. But Venezuela still had one card left to play. 3 of them, actually. Aging, but still lethal. F-16s. American jets, ironically enough. Venezuela had signed an agreement in 1982 to purchase 24 F-16s under the Peace Delta program, and they were delivered between 1983 and 1985, back when Caracas was a valued American ally, and these jets were the most advanced fighters in Latin America. But decades of sanctions had starved the fleet of spare parts and maintenance. Of the original 24 aircraft, only 3 remained operational. 3 was enough to make a point. And now, those same jets, built in American factories and sold during a very different era, were about to be used against the Navy that created them. At 6:49 in the morning, the Dunham's Combat Information Center hummed with quiet intensity. Blue light washed over the faces of a dozen sailors, each one focused on their console as the 2 radar returns sharpened on screen. Speed confirmed at 480 knots. Altitude dropping. The jets had descended below 3,000 feet. The captain stepped closer to the tactical display, watching 2 green triangles slice through the digital ocean, aimed directly at the blue square that represented his ship. When he asked for their closest point of approach, the operations specialist ran the calculation and delivered the answer. Less than 1 nautical mile. They would pass directly overhead. The captain didn't blink. He'd seen provocations before. Russian bombers off Alaska, Iranian fastboats in the Strait of Hormuz. But this was different. This was happening in America's backyard. And after what had happened 2 days earlier, everyone on that bridge knew the stakes had changed. He gave the order to set Condition 3, man all combat stations, weapons tight. The command echoed through the ship's passageways, and sailors moved with train efficiency. No panic, no hesitation, just the controlled rhythm of a crew that had trained for exactly this moment. By 6:52, the Venezuelan jets had crossed into the Dunham's outer defense envelope, 25 miles out. At their current speed, they'd be overhead in less than 3 minutes. In the electronic warfare suite, a petty officer leaned forward as a new emission appeared on his screen. X-band radar, the signature of an APG-66. That was the F-16's fire control radar, the same system used to lock onto targets before launching missiles. But it wasn't locked on. Not yet. The captain didn't flinch. He ordered his crew to maintain track, but not to illuminate. Lighting up the Venezuelan jets with the ship's own fire control radar would be the first step toward engagement, and exactly the reaction Venezuela wanted. A provocation that could be spun into an international incident. The Dunham would not give them that satisfaction. At 6:54, the first hints of the approaching jets became visible through the bridge windows, 2 dark specks against the pale sky, growing larger by the second. On the flight deck below, sailors paused mid-task and turned their eyes skyward as the distant whine of jet engines began to build, a sound that started as a hum and quickly sharpened into a roar. The jets were close enough now to make out details: the distinctive swept wings, a single vertical stabilizer, and the red, yellow, and blue roundels of the Venezuelan Air Force painted on each fuselage, and they were armed. The lead aircraft carried a centerline fuel tank, but the wing pylons weren't empty. Even from this distance, the silhouettes of air-to-air missiles were clearly visible. Sidewinder variants, heat seekers, short range. The captain absorbed this information without visible reaction. Sidewinders were defensive weapons not designed to sink ships, but at this range, pointed at this angle, the message was unmistakable. Venezuela was showing its teeth. At 6:55, the jets began their approach run. The lead F-16 dipped its nose and descended to barely 1,500 feet, while the wingmen followed in tight formation. On the Dunham Bridge, no one spoke. The only sound was the growing thunder of turbofan engines pushing through the Caribbean air. The Phalanx close-in weapon systems on the fantail rotated automatically, its white dome tracking the incoming aircraft. The system's radar had already calculated firing solutions, and its 20mm Gatling gun could put 4,500 rounds per minute into the sky. But the safeties were on. Weapons tight meant exactly that. No one fires unless fired upon. A Venezuelan fighter pilot and an American destroyer separated by nothing but 600 feet of salt air. Then, the jets were gone, pulling into a steep climb and banking hard toward the coast. The thunder faded, but the captain wasn't relaxing. He'd been in the Navy long enough to know that first passes were often just the opening move, and he was right to be cautious. At 7:02, the radar picture changed. The contacts were coming back around, lining up for another pass. This time, the approach was different. Instead of coming in together, the 2 F-16s split formation. One angled toward the destroyer's bow, while the other swung wide, arcing around to approach from the stern. It was a classic pincher maneuver, the kind of tactic designed to divide a ship's defensive attention. The captain keyed his radio to channel 16, the open frequency monitored by all vessels, and transmitted a warning. Venezuelan military aircraft, this is a United States Navy warship operating in international waters. You are conducting unsafe maneuvers in close proximity to a naval vessel. Maintain a safe distance and identify your intentions. Static. Then silence. The jets kept coming. At 7:04, the lead F-16 dropped to 800 feet below the horizon line now, screaming toward the destroyer like a missile with wings. And then, in the electronic warfare suite, alarms began to flash. The second F-16, the one that had circled wide, had activated its targeting radar. For 3 long seconds, the Dunham was painted with enough electromagnetic energy to guide a missile directly into her hull. The Aegis system responded automatically. Jamming frequencies activated, decoy launchers armed, and the Spy 1D radar shifted to enhanced tracking mode, painting both aircraft with enough precision to feed targeting data to any weapon system aboard. But no weapons were fired. The captain's order held. Weapons tight. Then, just as quickly as it started, the radar lock broke. The second F-16 pulled up and banked away, falling in behind its wingman as both jets climbed toward the Venezuelan coast. By 7:06, the aircraft had faded from radar, and the Caribbean fell quiet again. In the Combat Information Center, someone exhaled, a sound that carried more relief than any words could express. For the next hour, the Dunham continued her patrol, course unchanged, speed unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But in the Combat Direction Center, every second of the encounter was being reviewed. Radar tracks, electronic emissions, visual recordings from the ship's cameras, all of it logged, time-stamped, and encrypted for transmission back to Norfolk. By mid-morning, the footage had reached the Pentagon. Analysts replayed the approach frame by frame, and the conclusion was unanimous. This was a deliberate show of force. Not an attack, but a message. Venezuela wanted Washington to know that American ships operating near its coast would not go unchallenged. The official Pentagon statement came that afternoon, calling the maneuvers a, quote, highly provocative move, designed to interfere with counter-narcotics operations. In Caracas, the narrative was completely different. Venezuelan state television aired footage shot from the cockpit of one of the F-16s, showing the Dunham from above as a gray speck on the blue water. The anchor called it a heroic defense of Bolivarian sovereignty. Same ocean, same encounter, 2 completely different stories. But here's what the cameras didn't show. In the hours after the flyover, the Pentagon's response was already in motion. 10 F-35B stealth fighters from Marine Fighter Attack Squadron 225 were ordered to Puerto Rico, and the first aircraft landed at the former Roosevelt Roads Naval Station on September 13th with their unit markings removed for operational security. Additional destroyers repositioned closer to the Venezuelan coast, and somewhere beneath the Caribbean, American attack submarines quietly adjusted their patrol patterns. The jets may have made their point, but the Navy's answer was already taking shape. The situation didn't calm down. It escalated. 2 days after the first flyover, Venezuelan jets approached the Dunham again with the same tactics and the same message. Pentagon officials described the encounter as a, quote, game of chicken. On September 12th, the Dunham conducted an 8-hour boarding of a Venezuelan fishing vessel called the Carmen Rosa. Venezuela's foreign minister called it an illegal and hostile act. The Americans said they were searching for drugs. They found nothing. Meanwhile, Venezuela mobilized over 200,000 troops, and state media broadcast images of tanks, artillery, and militia units deploying to coastal positions. Then, in late October, the Pentagon played its biggest card. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest aircraft carrier, was ordered to the Caribbean. She arrived on November 16th with more than 70 aircraft and enough firepower to overwhelm most national militaries. The largest American naval deployment to Latin America since the Cold War was complete. What happened that morning of September 4th wasn't a battle. No shots were fired, no one was hurt. On paper, it barely qualifies as an incident. But ask anyone on that bridge or anyone watching the feeds back in Washington and Caracas, and they'll tell you it meant a whole lot more than that. This is what military folks call gray zone warfare. You don't cross the line into actual combat, but you get right up to the edge. You flex. You send a message. You see how the other guy reacts. Venezuela's F-16s were never going to attack that destroyer. Their pilots knew it, and the American crew knew it too. But in those few minutes, when the jets screamed overhead and the fire control radar painted the ship's hull, both sides were reminded of a fundamental truth. The line between provocation and catastrophe is measured in seconds. One nervous pilot, one misread signal, one itchy trigger finger, and the entire calculus changes. The Dunham crew held their discipline. They didn't react. They didn't escalate. They logged the encounter and continued their mission, demonstrating something that can't be taught in any classroom. Restraint under pressure is its own form of power. Venezuela proved it could fly jets over American warships. The United States proved it wouldn't be baited into a fight it didn't choose. Both sides claimed victory. Neither side blinked. And the Caribbean, that quiet stretch of water between two very different visions of the world, remained exactly what it's always been: contested, complicated, and one mistake away from chaos. So, let me ask you, if you were standing on that bridge watching two fighter jets diving toward your ship with their fire control radar painting your hull, what would you do? Would you hold your fire or light them up? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to support the channel directly, join the fleet. You'll get loyalty badges and priority replies, and you'll be helping us bring more true maritime stories to the surface. Just head on over to our channel page and click join, because out here, the difference between a close call and a headline is usually about 600 feet of airspace and a whole lot of discipline. I'll see you in the next one.